Hello, my name is Emma, and my research project, To Which Domains Does the Pro-Black Bias in Social Judgment Apply? No Evidence of Racial Bias in a Criminal Sentencing Judgment Bias Task, was completed as part of my undergraduate studies through the Fairfield University Psychology Department with my faculty mentor, Dr. Michael Andreychik. Our research was designed to further investigate a phenomenon known as a pro-Black bias, in which people demonstrate a social judgment bias favoring Blacks over whites in social judgment tasks. While the majority of evidence in psychological literature suggests that people show bias against Blacks and in favor of whites, recent research by Axe and colleagues has challenged this notion. Using a test called the Social Judgment Bias Task, researchers Axe and colleagues observed a social judgment bias favoring Black applicants over white applicants for admission into an academic honor society. The researchers termed this bias in favor of Blacks the pro-Black bias. Their findings suggest that theoretical models should not assume that people will always show bias in favor of majority groups, and rather should ask under what conditions do people favor or discriminate against majority and minority groups. At the time I was reading about this pro-Black bias, I was learning more about the issue of racial disproportionality within the United States criminal justice system and how there is a higher Black incarceration rate than white. I further looked into this issue and found evidence that Black offenders also tend to be given harsher sentences than white offenders for crimes of the same severity. I was interested how the presence of the pro-Black bias might be modified in other contexts, such as within the criminal justice system. Finding no other research that had been able to demonstrate the prevalence of the pro-Black bias outside of an honor society selection domain, I was curious if the bias might be limited to this paradigm, or if in fact it would be seen in other contexts. In turn, I decided to adapt Axe and colleagues' research and investigate the prevalence of the pro-Black bias in a criminal sentencing domain. Viewing this largely as an exploratory research project, we were unsure what the exact outcomes would be. However, we predicted that if participants did in fact show a pro-Black bias, they would sentence fewer Black offenders to long criminal sentences than white offenders for crimes of the same severity. To complete the study, we recruited 123 participants through the Fairfield University undergraduate psychology student participant pool. We then had to adapt Axe and colleagues' honor society selection task to the domain of criminal sentencing. Thus, we created the criminal sentencing judgment bias task. To create the task, we developed 64 unique offender profiles, building half to represent more severe offenses and half to represent less severe offenses, using 4 criteria categories. We decided to focus on criminal sentencing and drug offenses, as they have been shown to be the most sensitive to implicit and explicit racial profiling, with evidence showing that Blacks are often subject to harsher punishments and greater time served for drug trafficking and drug possession than white offenders, even when crimes committed are very similar or identical. We also assigned photos of Black offenders to half the profiles and photos of white offenders to half, and thus there was an equal number of Black and white offenders who completed both more and less severe crimes. Participants were told they would be tasked with playing the role of a judge who had to assign short and long mandatory sentences to offenders who had been convicted of different crimes. They were then presented with each offender profile one by one and told to weigh all criteria equally when making their decisions. As well, participants completed measures of their perception of performance on the task, self-reporting their actual performance and desired performance in regard to how they treated both Black and white offenders. As well, they completed measures of explicit bias, a measure of implicit bias using the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, and a demographic questionnaire. In designing this project, we made sure to use open science framework research practices to help reduce researcher bias, lay out our research plans, and make available to other researchers our studies materials. Our project's OSF page can be accessed by scanning the QR code in the bottom left-hand corner of the poster with your phone. Our overall finding was that there was in fact no prevalence of the pro-Black bias in the criminal sentencing domain. Participants showed similar accuracy rates for Black and white offenders when recommending sentences for less and more severe crimes. Secondly, results also showed that participants were able to somewhat accurately judge their own performance on the task, and thus were aware to some extent of whether they showed a pro-Black bias. Finally, pro-Black bias on the criminal sentencing judgment bias task was unrelated to participants' implicit preference for Blacks over whites, but was related to participants' explicit preference for Blacks over whites. These findings are important as they differ from that which was found by Axe and colleagues in their own research. Overall, these findings suggest the pro-Black bias might not be especially widespread and that it is in fact domain specific. One thing these findings could indicate is that we need to be more precise when talking about bias for and against minority groups. Rather than asking, is there bias, we might need to ask, in what specific domains does bias exist? This insight in itself is important due to the fact that people have sort of always assumed that regardless of the domain, people will show bias against minority groups. We did have some limitations to our study. First, we saw an overall lower accuracy rate on our criminal sentencing task than Axe and colleagues saw on their Honor Society selection tasks, which could be an alternative explanation to our findings. Further, we had concerns about the generalizability of our study and its results, as our participant pool was solely college students and largely female, and thus not representative of the entire population. Going forward, we have decided to address these issues and run our study again, specifically focusing on changes that will increase our accuracy rates and generalizability. We are excited to see what our results will show once we run our redesigned task again with a larger and more representative sample.